One night in December 1883, over 3,000 buffalo vanished from the Great Plains. No gunshots, no screams, no blood. When the Lakota people woke at dawn, the massive herd that had sustained them for generations was simply gone. The wind carried an unnatural silence across the frozen grasslands. Children who had fallen asleep to the distant rumbling of hooves woke to emptiness. The elders knew immediately something was terribly wrong. For centuries, the buffalo had been more than food. They were sacred relatives, providers of shelter, clothing, tools, and spiritual connection. The Lakota had followed their migration since time beyond memory, reading the seasons in their movements, finding meaning in their presence. Now, in a single night, that ancient bond had been severed. But how? And by whom? The morning started like any other. Women prepared to process the previous day's hunt. Men gathered their weapons for the morning tracking party. The autumn harvest had been lean, and the community was counting on this herd, the last significant gathering of buffalo they'd seen in months. The animals had been grazing just 2 miles from the winter camp, close enough that scouts checked them twice daily. Little Elk, a young scout barely 17 winters old, had reported the herd healthy and calm at sunset. He remembered counting approximately 3,000 animals, including calves. The bulls were restless but not alarmed. Everything seemed normal. He returned to camp, ate his evening meal, and fell asleep listening to the faint sounds of the herd in the distance. But when the dawn patrol left at first light, they found only emptiness. The hunting party stood at the grazing site in stunned silence. Frost covered the ground where the buffalo should have been. The grass was trampled, showing where thousands of animals had rested overnight. But there were no tracks leading away. No trail showing which direction they'd gone. The frozen earth should have preserved every hoofprint, every sign of movement. Instead, there was nothing. Red Cloud, the hunting party leader, knelt and pressed his hand against the cold ground. His face showed something the younger men had never seen before, confusion mixed with fear. He had tracked buffalo for 40 years, through every season, across every terrain. He could read their movements like words on a page. But this defied everything he knew. The scouts spread out in every direction, searching for any clue. They moved in expanding circles, covering miles of frozen plains. Nothing. It was as if the buffalo had been lifted into the sky itself. Some of the younger men whispered about the thunder beings, powerful spirits that could move across the sky. Others spoke of dark medicine, of curses and bad omens. The older hunters said nothing, but their silence was more frightening than any explanation. Imagine standing there that morning, the sun rising over empty plains, your community's survival depending on animals that had simply ceased to exist. No bodies, no blood, no answers. What would you think? By midday, the entire community had gathered at the empty grazing site. Women, children, elders, everyone needed to see it with their own eyes. The shaman, Walks with Thunder, performed a ceremony, burning sacred sage and calling to the spirits for guidance. The smoke rose straight into the windless sky, another unnatural sign. On the plains, there was always wind. The community stores were critically low. They had planned to process buffalo meat this week, to dry and store it for the harsh winter months ahead. Without this herd, they would face starvation before spring. Children would go hungry. Elders would weaken. The entire community's survival hung in the balance. But more than the practical loss, something spiritual had broken. The buffalo were not simply resources, they were relations, sacred beings who had agreed to sustain the people. This disappearance felt like abandonment, like a severing of the ancient covenant between the Lakota and the Buffalo Nation. Had they done something to anger the spirits? Had they broken some sacred law without knowing? Walks with Thunder spent 3 days in isolation, fasting and praying for vision. When he emerged, his face was grave. He had seen things in his prayers that disturbed him deeply, images of metal tracks stretching across the plains, of thunder sticks that killed from impossible distances, of mountains of buffalo skulls bleaching white under the sun. But he had seen something else, too, something that explained that impossible night. The shaman gathered the community at sunset 3 days after the disappearance. He stood before the central fire, and his voice carried across the cold air. "The buffalo did not leave us," he said. "They were taken." The story he told seemed impossible, yet it was the only explanation that fit the mystery. 2 miles north of where the herd had been, white men had been working for weeks on something the Lakota had watched with suspicion but not fully understood: the Iron Road, the railroad tracks that were cutting across the plains like scars on sacred skin. The railroad companies had a problem. Buffalo herds would stand on the tracks, blocking the trains for hours or even days. The massive animals were unafraid of the locomotives, and moving 3,000 buffalo was nearly impossible. So the railroad men had developed a solution, one so cruel and efficient that it would become a deliberate strategy to control the indigenous peoples who depended on the buffalo. That night, while the Lakota slept, a special train had arrived. Not a passenger train or a freight train, but a hunting train, armored cars with gunners positioned along both sides. The train had moved slowly past the herd, and in the span of 2 hours, professional hunters with repeating rifles had slaughtered every single animal. But here was the truly horrifying part. They didn't want the meat, the hides, or even the bones. They wanted the buffalo gone. Dead buffalo blocked the tracks just as effectively as living ones. So they had a second team ready, men with horses and chains, who dragged the carcasses away from the railroad corridor, pulling them into ravines and gullies where they couldn't be seen from the main trail. The Lakota hunting party had been searching the wrong area. They'd looked in the open plains, following traditional migration routes. They never thought to check the deep ravines north of the railroad, places where buffalo would never naturally go. Walks with Thunder had seen this in his vision: the ravines filled with death, hidden from view. He led a small party to investigate. What they found would haunt them forever. The ravine was 3 miles from their camp, cut deep into the earth by centuries of spring runoff. It was a place they rarely visited, shadowed and cold even in summer. As they approached, the smell hit them, first a thick, nauseating odor of death and gunpowder that made several men turn away to vomit. At the bottom of the ravine, piled 10 and 12 deep in some places, lay the entire herd, 3,000 buffalo slaughtered in a single night. Some were calves, still pressed against their mothers. Others were great bulls, their massive heads twisted at unnatural angles. The ravens and coyotes had already begun their work, but the sheer number of bodies meant most of the animals remained intact, frozen by the December cold. The hunters stood at the edge of the ravine in silence. There were no words for what they were seeing. This wasn't hunting. Hunting was sacred, a relationship of respect between predator and prey. This was extermination. This was waste on a scale that defied comprehension. The buffalo had been killed not for survival, not even for profit, but simply to clear them out of the way. Red Cloud sank to his knees, and tears froze on his face before they could fall. Other men wept openly. This was more than the loss of food or resources. This was genocide of their relations, the destruction of a sacred bond that had existed since the beginning of time. But they were also practical people, survivors who had endured centuries of hardship. They couldn't save the buffalo, but they could still use what had been so brutally taken. The community spent the next week in that ravine, processing as many carcasses as they could before they spoiled. They worked in shifts, harvesting meat, hides, bones, and sinew. They sang prayers for each animal, apologizing for this dishonor, thanking them for their sacrifice even in death. Yet as they worked, they knew this was just the beginning. If the railroad men could do this to 3,000 buffalo in a single night, what would stop them from doing it again? And again? How many more herds would vanish before the Buffalo Nation was destroyed entirely? The answer would become clear over the next decade. The mass slaughter of buffalo wasn't an accident or an isolated incident, it was a policy. Destroy the buffalo, and you destroy the indigenous peoples who depend on them. Force them onto reservations, break their independence, end their way of life. By 1890, Less than 7 years after that terrible night, fewer than 1,000 buffalo remained in all of North America. A population that had once numbered in the tens of millions, that had darkened the plains like living shadows, had been reduced to scattered survivors hiding in remote corners of the continent. The Lakota community that lost their herd that December night survived the winter, but barely. 3 elders died of starvation-related illness. Children suffered from malnutrition. The following spring, with no buffalo to hunt and their traditional lands increasingly restricted, many families were forced onto reservations where they became dependent on government rations often spoiled or insufficient. But something else survived too: memory. The story of the night the buffalo disappeared was passed down through generations. It became a teaching story, a reminder of what was lost and why it was lost. It spoke to the capacity for cruelty, but also to the resilience of a people who refused to let their culture die, even when their sacred relatives were slaughtered. Little Elk, the young scout who had last seen the herd alive, lived into his 90s. He told the story to his grandchildren, then to their children, never letting the details fade. He wanted them to know not just what happened, but what it meant. The buffalo weren't just killed for profit or convenience. They were killed to break a people who wouldn't be broken. Today, through careful conservation efforts led in large part by Native American communities, buffalo are slowly returning to the plains. Small herds roam on tribal lands, and the population has grown to over 500,000. It's a fraction of what once was, but it represents something profound: survival against impossible odds, the refusal to let a sacred relationship end completely. The old prophecies spoke of a time when the buffalo would return, and with them, the strength of the people would return too. That time is coming. The herds are growing. The land is healing. And the descendants of those who witnessed the disappearance are becoming the guardians of the return. The night the buffalo vanished became a story of loss, but it's also becoming a story of resilience, of communities that refused to disappear even when everything they depended on was taken away. The buffalo are returning, and with them, hope.